Lance's talk is around why Powell's writing sounds as it does, reflections on style. And before I do anything else, could I just remind everybody to have in front of them the soldier's art, either the Fontana copy or one of the other copies, because Lance will be referring to the text at the beginning of the soldier's art. So Lance has asked that we all have that in front of us as a reference point. Professor Lance Butler, in summary, basically has taught literature and literary style at universities of Stirling and Pau in France. He's the author of several books: Thomas Hardy, Samuel Beckett and the Meaning of Being, Victorian Doubt, and Registering the Difference, which is a study of the linguistic concept of register. He's recently published a new book of essays, Two Enlightenments, and he's chairman of the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle Centre in Edinburgh, from which I think Lance is talking to us. So I think this will be a particularly interesting lecture, and let me hand over to Lance and thank him for joining us for this online 2002 AP Society conference. Lance, over to you.
Thanks very much indeed. Welcome, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be speaking to the Anthony Powell Society. I've long been a great fan of Anthony Powell, and I remember at school I had a housemaster who used to get more and more excited over a period of about 18 months as he waited for the next volume of the dance to appear. And eventually he would run around the school clutching his new vol in hardback, saying, "This is the most marvelous novel. You boys must all read it in its entirety when you grow up." And that's what I did, because he was a jolly good housemaster and a jolly good English master, and I learnt a lot from him, and that was one of the things. It's absolutely great. And as you've just heard, I spent my entire life teaching English literature, my entire career teaching English. Oh, good heavens. That, I'm afraid, is a phone call. I don't really need that one. I'll get rid of my phone. Teaching English literature at universities, including most recently 15 years in a French university, where I was a professor of something they've invented called British literature. This was to distinguish me from the professor of American literature, and we also had a professor of linguistics. If you were my age and you'd been in Englit all my time, you'd have started in the quite pleasant world of F.R. Leavis and admiration for George Eliot and a general gentlemanly approach to the great canon of English literature. And as you probably all know, 1.5 tsunamis invaded our profession during my time, starting in the 80s, really, and then going on a rather good tsunami and then a half tsunami. And which were, I don't know, which wasn't so good. Anyway, these two things were, on the one hand, post-structuralism and deconstruction and Jacques Derrida and theory and literary theory, which has led to the most awful situation in English departments at the moment, where it's all about politics and what gender you are. And in my own university of Stirling, where I taught for 30 years, Jane Austen has now been taken off the syllabus for not being politically correct. In other words, we're no longer teaching literature, we're teaching politics and how to think, and it's a kind of Stalinism. But I'm afraid that's the result of deconstruction, although the original structuralist and deconstructive ideas were pretty good and refreshed our approach to Eng-Lit. The other tsunami, much more useful, I find, has been known as stylistics, which is the application of some linguistics to literary texts. The slogan there is, "A little linguistics can go a long way in literary analysis." And that began actually at the same time when people like Wayne Booth wrote a book called The Poetics of Prose, and people suddenly discovered that the analysis of poetry could be applied to prose, which has exactly the same stylistic elements in it, which can be looked at and measured in roughly the same way. Anyway, I've always thought that Powell, like his great avatar Proust, had a particularly wonderful style, that he had a tone and a quality which everybody who reads him knows and loves, unless they don't love it, in which case they stop reading him. And I'm sure everyone on this call has felt that sort of extraordinary tonal element in Powell, which makes every sentence a kind of joy. I feel the same with William Faulkner and one or two other writers, but not many. Dickens at his best. Anyway, we're looking at I quite believe that I could have proven my points. If you perhaps you don't agree, they're going to be proven. Make my points from any passage in Powell, and literally at random, I pulled off the bookshelf A Soldier's Art, and I managed to look at the first 4 or 5 pages, and everything I wanted to say is in there. So he is not only an extraordinary stylist, but a very consistent stylist, since I'm sure you'll agree that everything I'm going to say applies passim to his great novel, at least. Soldier's Art, 1966, the Middle of the War trilogy is volume 8 of Dance, the Middle of the War trilogy. The other bits are Valley of Bones and the Military Philosophers. Their stylistic consistency is absolutely remarkable. So I'm going to just have a look at the prose which is facing us on these early pages. And there's going to be a number of topics. I'll announce the topic and then tell you how it applies to Powell, and you can see if you agree. Okay, so the first one is that quite obviously what we have here as passim in Dance is an intradiegetic narrator. That is a narrator who participates in the plot, in the story, in what's going on, who is in fact a character, perhaps the chief character of the fiction. I put it to you that this narrator, Nick Jenkins, is evidently Anthony Powell, and there's a very, very close relationship between Nick Jenkins and Powell, and they both perform the role of narrator of all the things that happen in the story. This narrator is deep inside the text. It's not just occasional moments where the narrator sort of shoves his head in and mentions something. I mean, if you look at the first page of Soldier's Art, you'll see that there's an I in the first line, you know, when at the start of the whole business, I bought an army greatcoat. And if you look a couple of paragraphs down on the bottom of what is page 5 in this paperback edition, which I'm using, you will see that he looks at himself in the 3-sided looking glass. I too critically in the back view of the coat's shot at dawn. Look. Cut, I'm sorry. So there he is on the first page, and we have no difficulty, having read the first 7 volumes, to know that this is someone who is right in there telling the story almost as it happens. So this notion of who the narrator is, where he's positioned in relation to his own story, is an important part of narratology, and he is the intradiegetic narrator of all intradiegetic narrators, and he does very much imitate the Marcel, who is Marcel Proust's stand-in narrating À la recherche du temps perdu. Luckily, the mind which we enter, and I put it to you, with every page of Powell, you are entering not only an external story, in this case about soldierly life in the 1940s, but you're also entering, and more importantly, entering the mind of the narrator. There's no doubt that the idealist, realist question in philosophy is the material world real, and do thoughts follow? Or is the world of ideas real and the material world follows? Something which, by the way, is now suddenly back in fashion in places like the Arthur Conan Doyle Center, which is a spiritual center where I operate. Anyway, that idea is solved in Powell. It's absolutely clear that the events are the events of a mind, and that's the important thing. Without the mind, there would be no events to speak of, certainly not to be spoken of in this way. And luckily, this narrator is extremely detached, extremely humorous, and his mind is extremely well stocked. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that it's obvious to us that we're going to be treated to an extended metaphor, and the extended metaphor is going to be the theater of war as the theater of theater, that the theater is going to be used as an extended metaphor throughout this. And of course, he may be a lousy actor, but he's going to have to play his part. He doesn't feel he could be a great soldier, but he plays the part of soldier. Like he doesn't feel he could be a great actor, and on the stage he'd be pretty hopeless. But this is what he's condemned to: this action. Action we think of as real and acting as not real. Well, that distinction I think is already broken down in Powell. Acting and action, it's more or less the same thing. Doing and thinking are more or less the same thing. And this detaches us, and you have to shake yourself and remember that this is a story about one of the worst wars that humanity's ever endured, The Second World War involved a great deal of death, as it does in this novel, and a great deal of suffering, and it's being approached in a way it could easily be approached, and has been by many other novelists, as something deeply serious and deeply awful. And really, you've got to suck your teeth and make a long face and say, "Oh, good God, World War II," and you sort of climax on the word Holocaust. We're not going to get that. It's detached. And that's because what we're being presented with is the narrator's mind and his attractive attitudes to what is going on around him, and only going on around him, because this is not a panorama of the war. It's one individual view, and it's the view of the individual which is more important than the war. This makes it a kind of what Roland Barthes would call a writerly text. It's a text in which you feel writing. It's not a readerly text. In a readerly text, such as a detective story, most of the time, the narrator, the author, gets out of the way, and instead of putting in a lot of personal stuff or a lot of style, just lets you have the facts as they unravel, and the excitement is for you, for the reader, to do the unraveling. But in a writerly text such as this one, or Proust, you're constantly being reminded of the presence of the narrator, the presence of the writer, the fact that it is writing. It's a writerly text. So I put it to you as the second point, because of this extended metaphor, that this is not a novel about the Second World War. It's a novel about Nick Jenkins, brackets, Anthony Powell, and what it was like buying a greatcoat. And I've just written a book called Between Two Enlightenments, in which I make the point, apropos of Proust, that if you read Proust's descriptions, they are of no use to anyone. The description of a church would be of no use to, in Proust or Powell, would be of no use to religious people, or architects, or church historians, or whatever it is. You get no information, because it's not about the church. It's about Marcel looking at the church, and here it's about Powell looking at the war. Well, okay, so that's intradiegetic narrator, and it's the extended metaphor of theatre. And here's a third point. This is clearly, heavily symbolic. I mean, the thing is presented through a range of symbolisms, almost as dense as you would get in a religious text. I mean, right away in the first paragraph, the two headless tailor's dummies are described as allegorical figures, so it seemed, symbolizing dualisms and so on. I mean, he's not going to let you away with indeed, he's not going to ask you to do the work yourself. Powell doesn't say, well, consider this. I wonder if my readers will notice the subtle symbolism of the color yellow on page 13. No, he's going to say, look, I walked in, and what I saw was the symbolism with which you can read the text you are reading. He proposes symbolic ideas absolutely up front. And if you are able to move on to about three pages to what is in my edition the top of page 8, but I'll read it slowly, and you can get the idea even if you can't find it. It's in the paragraph beginning, "I left the shop," and it's towards the end. He's talking about these headless dummies, the Harlequin and the other one. The point was that their clothes were just right, while headlessness, like depicting love or justice, blindfold, might well signify the inexorable preordation of twin destinies that even war could not alter. Indeed, war, likely to offer both attributes unlimited range of expression, would also intensify rather than abate their ultimate fatality. Oh, this is Proust. Oh God, this is Powell at his most intense and dense, and we'll be talking about that in a minute. But it's perfectly clear that he thought about the symbolism. I mean, he really sees that under these circumstances, the headlessness of these two mannequins has a huge range of possibility, which the context of being about perhaps to die or watch your friends die renders more important. And there he is, faced with this sort of huge range of meaning. It's all about the meaning of the dummies, not the dummies, if you get the general idea. He's very good Powell at bridging the gap between Henry James's, and of course it was Aristotle's as well, big difference between telling and showing, diegesis and mimesis. You can either show it and then we have to do the working out, or you can tell it. And I think Powell is absolutely marvelous like this. I mean, you know these dummies meaning something. You know this great coat is significant. You can get some meaning, and then he tells you about it as well. He pushes you towards the meaning. A wonderful mixture of showing and telling by a great artist. The assistant, by the way, the shop assistant who is in there, is obviously symbolic himself. He's a sort of Delphic or mythological figure. Not quite, because Powell says so. He says that the headless figures are highly symbolic. He doesn't say the shop assistant is symbolic, but get this, look at this for a bit of style. If you read the opening of the second paragraph of the novel, that is the second paragraph, which for most of us will begin on the first page, you just look at that. I mean, he'll never say this person is a symbol. But look what he does say, and look how you can't do anything other than understand what is meant. An assistant, bent, elderly, bearded, with the congruous demeanor of a Levantine trader, bore the greatcoat out of a secret recess in the shadows and reverently invested me within its double-breasted, brass-buttoned, stiffly pleated khaki folds. He fastened the front with rapid, bony fingers, doing up the laps to the throat, then stepped back a couple of paces to judge the effect. Now, at no point are you told this is metaphor, this is symbol, this is allegory, but look what you're shown. I mean, this person is sort of very old, bent old, and he's like a Levantine trader, okay. But look, he doesn't carry the greatcoat out of a cupboard. He bears it out of a secret recess in the shadows. I mean, we are at Delphi. We are in some magical environment here. And he reverently, he carefully put it on me. He put it on me with a lot of respect. He was very respectful when he put the coat on me. No, we don't get that. We get he reverently invested me. I mean, an investiture such as we're going to have for the Prince of Wales, or not have for the Prince of Wales in the coming months, the terrible investiture of Charles when he was Prince of Wales, which he didn't like, and so on. You invest a king or a prince with something, or a priest, but no, he's reverently investing me, and then it's double-breasted, brass-butted, stiff, the khaki folds sort of come as a bit of a relief at the end of that. So the language tells you that this is a hieratic environment in which symbolism is appropriate to read without saying it, whereas previously I pointed out how he can also say it. And then the paragraph ends, does it not, with the anyway, the last words of the assistant are the Sibylline, I wish you a good run, have a good war, break a leg, don't break a leg. You can see where I'm going. Okay, so that's something about the symbolism which is omnipresent in Powell, and it's one of the reasons why he has the style that he has and sounds like he does. My next point is about the lexical density in Powell. He is a master, he's an organist really, isn't he? I mean, he's got all the stops and he can pull them out, and we'll be talking about that again in a moment. But just here's a first example. There are two kinds of word in the English language, as in, I suppose, every other. There are grammatical items and lexical items. And essentially, it's the lexical items that carry the core of the meaning, and the grammatical items just do a bit of positioning and organizing. So that, for example, the sentence, the cat sat on the mat, you have three lexical items, cat, sat, mat, which do have some semantic content. I mean, you can understand, if I come into the room and I say cat, sat, mat, you've probably got an idea of what I'm saying. But if you take the lexical items, the, on, the, I've said nothing at all. So the lexical density, that is the percentage of lexical terms, or lexical items in the cat sat on the mat, is 50%. There are three lexical items, cat, sat, mat, and three grammatical items, the, on thee. Now you can apply that analysis to any sentence in the English language quite clearly. Well, let's just have a little look. In the first paragraph, in the first sentence, there are 17 lexical items out of 42 total items. In other words, it's about the density, the lexical density is about 40%. In the first paragraph, in the second sentence, 14 lexical items appear out of 28 total items. That's what it is. It's a percentage of the total items. 14 out of 28, that's 50%. In the second paragraph, in the first sentence, there are 23 lexical items out of 36 items in total. That's 65%. But in the last paragraph on page 7, which I'm going to read to you in a moment, the sentence beginning, I left the shop, there are 19 lexical items out of 32 total items, in other words, 69%. And that would enable you to understand what's going on. Because if we now contrast the very first sentence, the one I've just been talking about, which was only at 40%, where, you know, when at the big start of the whole business, if you contrast that with the one at the I left the shop, at the bottom of page 7 of my edition, but anyway, you'll find it's on the bottom of the third page. I left the shop. Contrast these two. I'll read them. You can contrast the two. The first one has light, fairly light, only 40% lexical density. When at the start of the whole business, I bought an army greatcoat. It was at one of those places in the neighborhood of New, where, as well as officers' kit and outfits for sport, they hire or sell theatrical costume. And you probably think automatically that's a reasonably neutral English style. It's just telling you something that happened. You could almost hear someone just saying it in the pub. Not quite. There are grammatical reasons why it's written, not spoken, and there are several other things you could say. But that's fairly low lexical density. Now listen to the sentence beginning, I left the shop. Is that the right one? Yeah. I left the shop, allowing a final glance to fall on the pair of flamboyantly liveried dummies presiding from their glass prison over the somber vistas of coat hangers suspending tweed and whipcord. Nearly all of those words are lexical items, so you have to read more slowly, because the and on and at and by and me, all the grammatical items, well, they're very often monosyllables and you just swallow them. But when you get semantics, you have to, which means meaning, you've got to think about the meaning. So you've got to think here about, you know, flamboyantly liveried dummies, and they're presiding, and they're in a glass prison, and then the somber vistas of the coat hangers. So here you've gone up from 40% lexical density to 69%. And he can ring the changes. He's an organist who can pull out different stops. And there's a stop where he goes, I'll just keep this quite neutral lexical density right down 40. It's even lower in some other places in the novel. And then I'll turn it up. So where you're constantly being moved from one level to another. I should say that if you read the novels of Ivy Compton Burnett, partial contemporary of Powell, you will find them completely unreadable, because she never varies her lexical density and she never varies her register, so everybody speaks in the same way as each other and the narrator. And after a while you want to scream and go rushing from the room and burn the book, because there's no variety, there's no rhythm. But there's a super rhythm in Powell between the different levels of density and intensity. Okay, that gets us to register, which is the topic I wrote a book about called Registering the Difference, rather sort of cheeky title, haha. And register it's the basis of a lot of comedy, register shift, and it's the greatest basis of style, and it's the basis of why things feel as they do. You know, there's the story of the man who comes back from the trenches in the First World War, and someone says to him, oh my goodness me, you know, how was it in the trenches? And he says, I couldn't stand it. I mean, my dear, I mean, you know, the crowds and the people. It's the wrong register. You don't answer about, you know, the horrors of the First World War in such a light-hearted tone. It's a different register. And if you go to the doctor and you say, got a pain in my leg, and he feels you a bit, and then he says, you've got housemaid's knee. And then he turns to his yellow pad and he writes prepatellar bursitis. Now the pain in the knee, pain in the leg, and the housemaid's knee and prepatellar bursitis all refer to the same thing. So what's the difference? The difference is a difference of register. Obviously, the quasi-Latin, well, he writes on the high register, as in, for example, if you were a Russian aristocrat before the Russian Revolution, you spoke Russian to the servants and French to your friends. Well, French was a sort of version of a high register way of doing things. Register shift is one of these organ stops, one of these tools of style. And basically everything that you see or hear or read that is in language is either in a written style or a spoken style, and either in a formal style or an informal style. And if you just let's just go back to the opening paragraph again on page 5, you'll see that the register is slowly rising. I've just read you when at the start of the whole business, that's pretty casual. You don't write in a letter to your bank manager or in a parliamentary report, well, at the start of the whole business, we found there were too many migrants coming across. You might say, at the beginning of November, you wouldn't say at the start of the whole business. I bought an army greatcoat. It was at one of those places. If you're writing formal prose, you don't say, well, it was at one of those places where you can get a cup of coffee. You write, it was at a restaurant in whatever it is, cafe. And where they hire or sell. They, that sort of casual, that's where they do it, that's casual, informal, spoken English, low lexical density. So the register can be identified as at a particular, let's say, level of language. But as you go on, things do change. The atmosphere within, heavy with menace like an oriental bazaar, hinted at clandestine bargains, furtive even if not unlawful commerce, heightening the tension of an already novel undertaking. The deal, oh, we've gone down again. Oh my God, the deal was negotiated in an upper room, dark and mysterious, draped with skiing gear. He's shifting around in the register, and riding breeches, in the background of which, behind the glass windows of a high display case, 2 headless trunks stood rigidly at attention. One of these effigies wore Harlequin's diagonally spangled tights, the other scarlet full-dress uniform of some infantry regiment. Quite light, isn't it? And then it gets heavier, allegorical figures. So it seemed, symbolizing dualisms of the antithetical stock in trade surrounding them, civil and military, work and played, and so on. You can see he's actually playing with you. He's slipping in little things like the whole business and sort of one of these and the other. So it seemed, out of a different register. But the register is basically really quite serious. What does that represent? It represents the light attitude we are being expected to take to his time in the Second World War, interspersed with people being killed, interspersed with more solemn things. Widmerpool in the midst of global conflict, comedy in the midst of tragedy. That's the point. That's the whole Powell style, because it's the whole Powell meaning. A little detachment, ladies and gentlemen, a little Buddhism perhaps. Step back for a moment, smile. Well, that's register. I mean, if you look at the next page, you'll see that there's a paragraph that goes, I have absolutely no histrionic talent. Now, that's fairly high register because, you could just say, I can't act for toffee. That would be low spoken register. And you look at this and you'll see that, the register again shifts here, all sorts of things like, something a shade more profound than a farce of yesteryear, treating boisterously of gunroom life in the Royal Navy, might have been more gratifying to self-esteem. That feels like higher register because it's a longer sentence. If it's more formal, it'll be a longer series of clauses, as well as a higher level of actual vocabulary, that kind of thing. Okay, well, I want to move on because there are quite a few other topics. They all tend in the same direction, as perhaps you've already noticed. If you go beyond where I normally went, go to about page 9. I don't know whether you'll be able to do this, but you'll see a few things in the paragraph, but it's about the 4th or 5th page, the paragraph beginning, after our first local blitz, when they killed 1,000 people, notice that. At that stage of the war, regarded as quite a large number for a provincial city in a single night, Major General Liddermont, the divisional commander, ordered the defense platoon to mount Bren's, blah, blah, blah. That is a left branching sentence. That is to say, before the subject, and thus before the verb, there's a lot of adjunct, there's a lot of adverbial stuff. Do you see that the sentence should begin, Major General Liddermont, divisional commander, ordered the defense platoon to mount Bren's, and then all the adjuncts and adverbials should come afterwards? That would be a normal right branching sentence. But Powell, who can do that, nonetheless here chooses to slip into that huge left branch before the subject, before the verb, after our first local bit, when they killed 1,000 people at that stage in the war, regarded as quite a large number. And again, you know, there's a deep seriousness in that. I mean, 1,000 people are dead after this air raid, for God's sake. And yet, by not prioritizing it, by putting it in that sort of preliminary left branch, you know, he insists on a slightly, very slightly humorous attitude, you know, regarded as quite a large number. You know, later on, lots more people got killed. I mean, good God, in those days, we thought 1,000 was quite a lot. Oh, we don't anymore. And there's just that slight element of irony or comedy or paradox about it, which alleviates it from being the tragedy that, of course, he recognizes it is. And further down in the middle of that paragraph, there's rather a wonderful sentence beginning, announced by the melancholy dirge. Announced by the melancholy dirge of sirens, like ritual wailings at barbarous obsequies, the German planes used to arrive. He's done it again. You don't know what he's talking about. You know, you have to hold it in suspension. It's minor, though wonderful. And then when the major thing comes, the subject and the verb, you have a different attitude towards it. So those are left and right branching sentences, which again, he does both, and he manipulates them beautifully. There's another thing in stylistics, which is, of course, simply the actual linguistics to a text, in this case, a literary text, and that is a thing called nominalization. You will have noticed, perhaps if you've read George Orwell's essay about how to write English, you'll know that nominalization is something that foreigners do, and that's why their language, their papers and their communications are often rather difficult to follow, because they have pile-on nouns, that's nominalization, and they don't pile on verbs. A very simple example would be if I say, I am in expectation of his arrival. That's heavily nominalized, whereas I think he's coming soon is verbalized, because in the first, I am in expectation of his arrival, we have one verb and two nouns, while in the second one, I think he's coming soon, we have two or even three verbs, if you count the is as a verb, and no nouns, but you get the same meaning. So one is nominalized, and a lot of nominalization in English, of course, as in French, includes words ending T-I-O-N, you know, expectation and aberration. You know, he made a mistake. There was an aberration. Well, you know, it's a slightly different tone. That's a difference in register, of course, but it's also a difference in nominalization. So if you look at the sentence on my page 8, which is, I think, what is it? It's about the 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes, it's the 4th page. Yes, in the middle of that page, in the paragraph beginning, looking back from a disturbed, though at the time monotonous present, you'll see the word Arcadian, and I want to draw your attention to the sentence which begins even after the word Arcadian in that sentence. And I'm asking you to look at nominalization here. Even the threatening arbitrament of war, the Prime Minister's rather ornate phrase in his broadcast, had lent a certain macabre excitement to the weeks leading up to the purchase of the greatcoat. If you count the nouns in there, there's an awful lot. I mean, the threatening arbitrament of war, you know, what it means is, you know, everybody was frightened because war was going to happen, And so they did certain things. That's all verbal, you know, being frightened and things are going to happen and them expecting and so on. But the threatening arbitrament of war has no verbs in it at all. It's just nouns. And the Prime Minister's rather ornate phrase in his broadcast, there are no verbs. Whereas you could have said, as the Prime Minister said when he gave his broadcast, which would have two verbs in it. But Powell has gone for this very heavy nominalized English. And then there's a verb, had lent, and then a certain macabre excitement to the weeks leading up to the purchase of the greatcoat. Sort of, and he could have said, you know, during the time when I was waiting to buy the greatcoat, for, you know, I became excited and I became anxious. You know, he could put in verbs, but he doesn't. And that distances it, makes it more formal register, makes it heavier in a way, greater lexical density. All these things come together. But he doesn't just stick to that, or else it'd be like reading Edward Gibbon. I mean, after 2 pages of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, you know you've been in the presence of genius, but you don't want to read any more because it's so clotted with nouns and dense lexicality that you just can't go on. You want a glass of water. It's like, give me a verb, you know. Okay, so another thing, that's nominalization. Powell is also a king of omission. If you look at the bottom of page 6, that is the bottom of the second page, in mine at any rate, it is a paragraph beginning, it was clear. You'll see, well, in fact, it is just the beginning of that paragraph. It was clear. It was clear, this is the shop assistant, of course. It was clear that he had remained unflustered by recent public events. At the age he had reached, perhaps disillusioned with the commonplaces of life. And you have to read it twice. You know, it was clear that he had remained unflustered by recent public events. And then he's omitted something. At the age he had reached, he was perhaps disillusioned with the commonplaces of life. And then there's a semicolon, and then there should be, and he was too keen a theatre goer. But in those two cases, there's no and was. He simply omits these copular verbs, the verb to be, quite often. Most people would say, and he was, and there was this, and there was that, but he'll just move straight on to the point without the verb to be. And it's quite remarkable. I mean, if you look at the top of page 7 there, he was too keen a theatre goer to spare time for any but the columns of dramatic criticism. Wait a minute. Oh, okay. Too keen a theatre goer to spare time for anything but reading the columns. But he doesn't put in the verb. He omits things in order to create a tenser structure, I think, make you read more intensely at the last. And I've got 10 lines up from that on my page 6. There's a rather interesting moment where he uses the word ponderous, and then ponderous, comma, out of place. You know, a personal definition at such a point would have been ponderous, comma, out of place. Almost any other writer would have written ponderous and out of place, but he doesn't. He just puts a comma. So he's a king of all these different little tricks, as it were, of style, or things which create style, including that kind of omission. He's also very good at inversion. He'll put things upside down, you know, into a world no less enigmatic, he will say, rather than, you know, into a more complicated world. He inverts, you know, the adjectival element from the nominal element. The world is no less enigmatic. It's the wrong way round. The adjectival element in English normally comes first. Equally, he's a king of free and direct speech. You know, something pretty well invented by Jane Austen. You know, Emma retired to her boudoir, exclamation, what a terrible day, is free and direct speech. Could be Emma. And you feel both. You know, you're being brought in as an accomplice because you also feel what a terrible day. And Emma is obviously thinking what a terrible day. So obviously Jane Austen and the narrator are thinking we're all thinking what a terrible day, which is why it's called free and direct speech. It's a very, very good novelistic technique of which she is a mistress. And there's a bit in this, there's not much in this passage, but near the top of page 7, there's a 4th page there, he says at a certain moment, time was short. And you're supposed to think that time was short for getting the greatcoat and getting on. Time was short before the war was. Time is short because the war is going to kill some of us, so our lives are short. We have this sort of indeterminate narrative voice behind a little thing like that, which we call a free and direct speech. And of course, Powell is a master of that too. And besides that, I must keep an eye on the time. Besides that, one of the big things, the thing I'm going to end on here really, is his profound use of one of the greatest inventions of modern criticism, which is the old-fashioned notion of intertextuality. It used to be called things like influence or school of. But none of the words were used before the French Gérard Genette introduced and invented intertextuality does as well as intertextuality, because just as we are all related, and we are all related to trees and rocks, and we're all related to black holes and each other, the universe is a relational entity. So in all writing, there is an endless number of connections and interconnections between one text and another, and that includes all spoken and all written texts that have ever happened, at least in the language concerned. After all, none of the words I've used this evening has been alien to you, I hope, because I'm speaking a language that you speak too. And every time I say something, say like shield or cross or rich, you don't think, oh yes, a cross, that's one of those things like this. I mean, you've got Jesus in there, you've got the New Testament in there anyway. And when I say shield, you may think about COVID, or you may think about a knight going on the Crusades with his big shield with the cross on it. You can't avoid that. Those are very obvious ideas of the interconnectedness of everything. Well, intertextuality, of course, is one of Powell's specialities. You must have felt, reading this passage, reading Dance, that he's read a lot of books. Nick Jenkins, after all, is a writer. You must feel that this style is bolstered, buttressed by the ideas, the phrases, the vague notions, the texts of other people, especially other writers, this vast web, this weaving of meaning and illusion, a kind of collective unconscious for language. A colleague once said to me, intertextuality, he says, I don't like talking about it because where does it stop? And the answer is, it doesn't stop. One thing brings on another. I remember a wonderful example discussing an enigmatic passage in Thomas Hardy, where an amazing scene in that much misunderstood novel, Thomas Hardy, Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which people think of as the critical point is a rape scene, which actually isn't a rape, that Alec d'Urberville is evil when in fact he's a good man. Anyway, one of the points that I was trying to make was when he meets Tess by accident and he's given up his money, he's gone off to be a preacher because he feels so guilty, and he sees her again and he can't resist her. And so he takes her to a place called Cross in Hand, and he makes her put her hand on the cross in hand and vow to cease tempting him. So desperate is the poor man. And of course, he's going to end up murdered with his blood on the ceiling or on the floor if you happen to be in the room from below. That terrible fate for Alec d'Urberville is, of course, erased by the idea that, Tess is a victim. Of course, she is too. She is the prime victim. But Alex, as everybody in Hardy, is equally victimized. So that's a different reading of a great novel. I recommend it to you. But anyway, cross in hand, there's a stone, a pagan stone, where it's not a cross. There isn't a hand. It's just called cross in hand because that's what it's called. But Hardy picks it up from a map of Dorset and uses it. Why? Because we know that swearing, I vow, I swear I'll do this. I put up my hand to it. And we know what a cross means. It's a sacred vow. He picks out, as it were, the intertexts of those words, of the two lexical words, cross and hand, not the grammatical word, the. So when I read in the first paragraph of Soldier's Art, in an upper room, it's there as an intertext from the New Testament. We all know what happened in the upper room, where the Last Supper before Jesus is killed happens in an upper room in the Authorized Version. This is not random. It's not he just wanted to mention. I mean, why make it an upper room? Why not just have the shop on the ground floor? Like most shops. It's in an upper room for a reason. And the reason is the intertexts which it conjures up. It creates this heavy, serious register in the midst of a satirical comedy about a shop assistant. Equally, in that same paragraph, the mannequins are two headless trunks. Now, you can't collocate those two words without thinking of Ozymandias, Shelley's poem about the devastation of a civilization. Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert, and the head, you all know the poem, the head of this statue which has been knocked over, and there's nothing else there, nothing else remains. The head is separated and lies half buried in the sand. That's the result of war. That's the result of the greatest civilization. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. And the desert stretches all around, and there's nothing else to see. That's what we do to ourselves when we go to war, I think. So the headless trunks, he just means they don't have, heads on. But you can't say headless trunks without conjuring up Shelley. And the Harlequin, of course, is a figure from the Commedia dell'arte. And there's a kind of commedia dell'arte going on here. I mean, this is a comedy, isn't it? And that's a reference to Balzac thus as well, La Comédie Humaine, thus reference to Dante, Divina Commedia. And we have War and Peace in that. But if you look into the second paragraph, which we've already looked at a bit, you'll see we have bony fingers. Now, I know that you all thought of death, or skeletons, or age, or the point where you get bony fingers, or something sinister, or something gothic. You all did, you thought of it without thinking of it, perhaps. Somewhere in our collective unconscious, the great intertext in which we all live, there are bony fingers. I tried to find an actual moment, like the Shelley moment, and all I could find was a group called Mode, who wrote a song in 1974 called Bony Fingers, and it has the, as your bony fingers close around me, long and spindly, death becomes me. Oh, so death and bony fingers do go together. You're going to say, but that's 1974. That was after dance was finished. Doesn't matter. Intertexts work across time in both directions, because now we could easily do as I did, hear that song before reading the text. And of course, the text doesn't exist on paper. The text exists every time you read it in your head, just as the experiences of Nick Jenkins and Anthony Powell exist not on paper, but in their minds. And this is a representation of it. Then, of course, we have like Alice, and one intertext generates another, one meaning generates another. Instead of saying that it's a three-sided mirror, you must have noticed he said it's a three-sided looking glass that he looks in to see whether he looks natty in his new amazing greatcoat. And having mentioned looking glass, of course, he doesn't have much choice but to mention Alice. And of course, the idea is that Alice is going to plunge down a chaotic rabbit hole out of which she has no means of getting, and yet it's a comedy as well as a weird kind of tragedy. Absolutely straight into text, which he, of course, owns up to by mentioning Alice. And then you have to think, well, what is the meaning of Lewis Carroll's book? And it's not altogether comforting. And even a word, the top of the next page, I think it is, well, just after like Alice, where he refers to habiliments for clothes and uniforms and things, habiliments. Now, that's a very high register word. I'm going to put on my habiliments. You might think I was going mad if I said that, but if you look it up in a literary corpus, I've just found one place where it was, but there are plenty of others. Edgar Allan Poe, The Masque of the Red Death, where he refers to the habiliments of the grave. The masker who masks the Red Death, who is the Red Death, comes in wearing the habiliments of the grave. There's death in bony fingers, and there's death in the word habiliments, even though technically it's not there. We know it's there because of references, because of intertextuality. And then the middle watch. I mean, you might have wondered, would you look it up? You probably didn't. Actually, there was a play which itself was made into two films, the play from 1920s and the two films from 1930 and 1940, respectively, called The Middle Watch. It's a comedy, as he describes it. It's a comedy. So that's what The Middle Watch is, as well as, God, I'm in the middle of a bloody war. And then, I'm not going to go on much longer, but there's another thing, another intertextuality, perfectly obvious. Honour and wit for damned they sit in the last paragraph of page 7. Honor and wit for damned they sit. And it's a reference to the headless figures, and they make him, Dick Jenkins, think about Kipling's lesser known poem, Tomlinson. Tomlinson is a bore, a dull man, sent to hell, but rejected by Satan as being too soulless. You know, he's just a kind of mannequin, and Satan says we're not going to have much fun with him and sends him back to life because he's such a, just as the hilarious, ghastly bore Widmerpool will be sent back into the life of this novel time and time again. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Lance. That was very interesting. Right, who's comments? Nick Burns.
I was just clapping. I didn't mean to raise my hand, but that was a remarkable talk, and I think that sort of close analysis is very much something AP has not received, and that he should have received. And I loved the point that he and all writers and Lance himself is trafficking in a kind of commonality of language. And that's the fascinating thing about the language of dance. It's a shared speech that is given these very intricate and idiosyncratic turns. And I also really liked the point that Lance made at the very beginning, that the narrator has very intradiegetic and very much with us, because people often talk about the unobtrusiveness of the narrator. He's self-effacing. We don't know much about his life, but he's with us so much. So thank you very much for that point, Lance.
That's great. I think you're completely right about that. That's wonderful. In fact, you summarized quite a chunk of my talk rather neatly there.
Okay. Who else? Anybody else want to put up a hand? And
a lot of making nice noises in the chat, but that's just compliments, you know.
Yeah, so I was just looking at the chat. Yeah. Paul.
Yeah, thank you, Lance. I'm in a tour de force, to be honest.
Yes.
the other writer that it struck me was Dickens. I mean, I'm struck. I mean, obviously, AP had a very strong visual sense, didn't he? As from a boy at Eton, doing these cartoons and things like that. And at points, his observation of people and the way he brings them to life, the elderly shop assistant, reminded me of Dickens in that way, that Dickens would almost sort of play out these characters. And when he says he has no histrionic talent himself, I mean, I think his sensibility is very much visual and theatrical at points, isn't it?
I like that very much. You're quite right. I mean, it is Dickens was, of course, the absolute master of this. I mean, you know, he had parenthetical legs. Dickens says about somebody.
Yes.
I mean, he can, you know, and it's linguistic, but you know what he means in real life as well.
And I think the bony fingers, I think, is Scrooge in Christmas Carol, if I remember correctly.
Of course it is. Yes.
Yeah. Gerald Ruderman.
Thank you. So thank you, Lance. So we have another overcoat here. Why do overcoats keep appearing?
Okay, give me a few other overcoats that you've enjoyed.
Well, there's Widmerpool's inappropriate overcoat.
Yep.
And just later on here we have Bithell's Macintosh, which isn't quite an overcoat, but something.
Yeah.
You're right. I mean, I always think that there's something slightly funny about top clothes. You know, I mean, Dickens has people wearing waistcoats, jackets, and those enormous things that a coachman used to wear, coachman's overcoat. And Dickens says that people in these conditions, if you get two men who've been given the similar coats, the large man would have been given the small coat and the small man would have been given the large coat, you know. I mean, there's a kind of comedy there, which is not available, I think, in people just wearing, you know, shorts and a T-shirt.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, indeed. John Trotter.
Thank you very much for a really scintillating talk. There's so much to digest in that. I really enjoyed it.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much indeed. Just two thoughts always strike me about his style. One is the use of abstract nouns, and the other is the use of the passive voice. And I just wondered if you'd like to say anything about abstract nouns, because there's a good example in the paragraph you showed us to that starts, "I have absolutely no histrionic talent."
Yeah.
Then you get a change of tone by him saying identification with something a shade more profound than a farce of yesteryear, treating boisterously, etc., etc. It jumps into several abstract nouns governing the verbs in that sentence.
Absolutely. And I mean, of course, the point about abstract nouns is that they're abstract. That is to say, if I begin a sentence with sort of, animation, I'm not saying who's animated or what way they're animated, it's just sort of out there. Animation, it may be me, it may be you. It detaches us so that, again, you're kind of lured in. So your example here is identification. Well, I mean, almost anything could follow identification. So you have to identification with, you notice, yes, okay, with something a shade more profound. Even the something is rather abstract, isn't it? Something a shade more profound. Could be anything. They're the open nouns, aren't they? Open to filling in, and you've got to wait for him to fill it in. What again? A farce of yesteryear, and that brings it down, doesn't it? I mean, down with farce, back up again with yesteryear. I mean, he's playing with us. We're like fish at the end of on his hook, And abstract nouns do that brilliantly.
Thank you.
Yeah. Colin.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes? I'm absolutely with everyone else. It's absolutely fascinating. And I'm certainly with Nick in hoping we can have a lot more of this sort of stuff, because it's really, really rewarding. My question, Lance, is about sentence length. I mean, in my day job, which is sort of writing investment stuff, where told not to write more than some 30-word sentences. That one that you identified as a left branching sentence after the Blitz, that's 65 words long, which is incredibly long, I think. I mean, what do you think he's doing by giving the reader such a sort of mouthful to digest, and how does that compare to Proust and others, and sort of others?
Yes, I mean, my sort of chopping block here is always Ivy Compton Burnett with her unreadable books, novels. Not only is the style absolute, so the butler talks the same way as the Duchess, and they both talk exactly the same way as the narrator. And those sentences are not only similar stylistically in other ways, but all the sentences tend to be approximately the same length, which is one of the reasons that her books are completely unreadable. Proust, you remember, is famous for the longest sentence in the world. And there's the joke about, or the party game, if you wrote it on the bottom of a wine bottle, how many times would it go round? And the answer is 7.5 or 17.5, something. So he has the long sentences. But remember, Longtemps je me suis couché de bonne heure, the opening sentence of À la Recherche is a short one. And there are moments when he will end a long orotund paragraph with Il est mort. He's dead. So he does that rhythm thing of long, and that's been one of my themes, hasn't it? Sort of high register and low register, high lexical density, low lexical density, long sentences, short sentences. And Powell is an absolute master of that, because what it does is, like all good style, I think, it makes you think that the writer is thinking. And so you think about your thoughts and his together through the prose. It's in our minds. You can feel Powell thinking, because he goes long sentence, long sentence, long sentence, and then I left. In other words, the rhythm is like the rhythm, supposed anyway, of human thought, whereby you're considering and you can't understand and that sort of thing. But God, it's 6 o'clock, I've got to go. So it's creation of that same rhythm, and so he goes from to answer the previous question as well. He'll go from abstract to concrete and back again. So we're playing, you know, a quick an allegro movement followed by an andante movement. It's that endless systole and diastole that so much art has. The rhythms and dynamics of poetry, obviously of music, even I believe of painting and sculpture, require those changes so that you have a long sweeping line and then you have something bunched up rather closely, and that creates, you know, rhythm in the sculpture. So I do think it's that. I also think that long sentences are opportunities for comedy. I mean, you know, Samuel Beckett has been credited with writing a comedy of exhaustive enumeration. You know, you start saying, well, there was this, and then there was this, and then there was this, and then there was that, and there was that. And after a while, you become mesmerized by this thing, and you start giggling, you know. So I think the long sentence can do that. Do you have an opinion yourself, Colin, about the long sentences?
Yeah, I think I mean, I think he's slightly taking the mickey by extending them out. So it is a kind of shared joke. Just how long can I keep this up? But yeah, it certainly divides opinion. And one of the reasons that many of my friends can't bear Anthony Powell because they can't put up with.
Yes, well, they just need more things holding their ears apart other than atmospheric pressure. That's what it is. Because I mean, he's a clever writer. I mean, you know, you don't have to know the technical details I've been saying, but you do have to go along with him. If you don't recognize the intertexts, you've got to recognize that there's probably something behind this. And if you feel the shifts in register, you don't have to know the word register, you just have to feel the shift. And I think good readers do. I think he invites good reading, and that's why he's a good writer. You know? Well, we've done our hour, gentlemen and ladies.
Alf, you're...
Yeah, if it's time. When you were talking about the writerly perspective towards the beginning of your talk, it occurred to me that the observations he makes about the assistant on probably about the top of the third page, I should think, the paragraph beginning, it was clear he had remained unflustered. Well, that seemed to be almost like a kind of semi-manifesto of Powell being the writerly writer. He even says at the end of it, that was an understandable outlook. In other words, identifying with it.
That's a terrific paragraph, isn't it? I mean, and that ending, look, there's a short sentence for you. That was an understandable outlook. I mean, who's he including in as the reader of that, you know? And previously we've had the key, if you want an abstract now, and to go back to a previous question, just before that we've had clouding the keenness of aesthetic consideration. You have to think twice about what it means, don't you? But what is your point exactly about that? It's
as if he is projecting onto the assistant this writerly perspective.
Yes, I see what you mean.
Without saying I'm a writerly writer.
Yes, that's right. Yes, but after all, who else has remained unfluttered by recent public events? Actually, it's going to be the narrator as well, isn't it? Yes. I mean, permitting no international crises. I mean, you know, come on, nobody talks like that. And that pulls us as educated readers rather onto his side, and brings the assistant into a special perspective, which is indeed writerly. I like that.
So
after that, quite soon after that, sorry, go on.
Yeah, so I'm just going to draw it to a close then, Lance, as we're now at an hour and 10 minutes. Just to say again, thank you so much for an absolutely very stimulating and illuminating talk. And as Nicholas Burns said, I mean, we could do with more of this, and I will go back to the Soldier's Art and read it more carefully. I think a little bit on the greatcoat. Ferdy Mount at our AGM said that at Eton, of course, the uniform was standard. So the individuality of boys was often from their overcoats and outer garments. And he said actually there was a couple of boys there who were distinguished by their overcoats being not quite comme il faut. And it became a kind of a running code for he's trying a bit too hard or he hasn't got it quite right. So I think that's again something that AP would have picked up when he was at Eton.
Of course.
So anyway, thank you very much indeed, Lance, and thank you for being
Yes,
such a
thank you.
fan of AP and helping us understand him better. And we look forward to your contributions in future. And thanks to everybody. We've had a very full audience here for
Yes.
this lecture, and we look forward to the next one in December, which will be our chairman Robbie Bino talking on the Fisher King. So
Wednesday, the 14th of December.
correct. So we hope to see as many of you as you can make it for that.
Before that, we ought to say we have the annual lecture.
Yes, indeed.
Wednesday the 7th at the Travellers Club, where Simon Barnes is talking on the naive and sentimental Powellite.
And I think we're not quite sold out. We're doing very well.
We're not quite sold out.
We've got a few left. So those of you that can make it,
yeah,
please contact us for tickets.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and I've enjoyed it very much. I'll no doubt speak to you again if you will allow me to.
Yep.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you very much, Lance. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All the
Good
best.
night.